Welcome to the Guts Podcast. I'm your host, Joey Donovan Guido, and it's hard to believe we're already at episode 10 of this podcast. Thank you to everyone who's been listening and to all my guests. And on that note, today we'll be talking with an awesome guest, a longtime colleague and brain guru, Mark Brady, Ph.D., and I met Mark over a decade ago when I was writing a blog called Daddy Brain. And back then, I interviewed Mark about topics like children's brain development, parenting, and positive and negative forms of discipline. Mark is a transpersonal neurobiologist, neuroscience educator, and recent throat cancer survivor. He spent 10 years at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, one of the nation's premier think tanks. And according to him, he was stalking behavioral scientists in their natural habitat, undercover as the maintenance man. Mark is also the prize-winning author of a number of books, many of which I've read, magazine articles, and academic papers, and he's published the Flowering Brain blog regularly for 14 years. And as you may have guessed, today's topic is brain-centric, and it's an important one. It's all about trauma. And some of the things we'll be discussing today include how to identify and deal with trauma, trauma and disease, and how we can help children deal with trauma. And with that, Mark, I'd like to welcome you.
Thank you, Joey. Good to be here.
Yeah. Before we start with the official questions, I have to ask you if you can briefly tell us a little bit about this stalking behavioral scientists as a maintenance man.
So for many years, I lived in the Bay Area, and over again, over the years, I would drive by this sign that said Center for Behavioral Sciences and Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. And I was always curious about the place. It had a privacy gate and electronic privacy gate, and I often wondered what went on up there. And so one day I just happened to be picking up our local little newspaper, and there was an ad in there for somebody to come and be the maintenance man at this center. And I wasn't looking for a job, and I certainly wasn't looking for a job as a maintenance man. I have a number of advanced degrees, and I don't really have any interest in that kind of work. But I decided that this would be an opportunity to get behind the gate and go see the place. So I went up, and they invited me to this conference room, and these two lovely women, we sat down together, and we just had this really relaxed conversation. And I left, and before I got home, they had called and left a message on my answering machine offering me the job. I thought, oh, now what do I do? I thought, and it was a struggle, right? And so basically what I ended up doing was I convinced myself, well, I don't have to take this job for the rest of my life, right? I can do it for 6 months and just get a feel for the organization, what they do and how they operate and things. And it ended up, it was only a half-time job. So I had, and they paid you at a full-time wage, right? Stanford's a very wealthy institution. And so I ended up staying there for 10 years.
Wow.
And I met all kinds of really, premier behavioral scientists, Nobel Prize winners, Guggenheim Fellows, MacArthur Genius Award winners. It was just really interesting and I had, part of what was really interesting about it was I had access to all their studies. So I would periodically have to go into these studies for different reasons, and I could see how many of them organize their work.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
And one of the big takeaways for me from my time there is that all these people had one thing in common, and that was they all drilled down into a really narrow frame of a study. So, for example, Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of how memory works. For 30 years, he studied two neurons that are visible in the California sea snail. For 30 years, that was his profession, and he ended up winning the Nobel Prize for that discovery.
Wow. That's an interesting point about the narrow focus, too. I think that sometimes we try to do too much and things are too broad, and then we wind up being very topical, superficial, you know?
Right.
So, well, thank you for explaining that because I was curious when I read it in your bio. I said, I need to ask Mark about this. So thanks for taking that question on the fly. So, yeah, so today we are going to be talking all about trauma. And my first question for you is an extremely personal one. And I was looking to see if you could tell me about your experience as a throat cancer survivor. What kind of trauma did you deal with because of the disease?
Well, the whole experience is really instructive in many regards. So I don't know how familiar you are with the concept of the hero's journey.
Somewhat, yep.
So there's like a series of stages that you go through, and it's used a lot in contemporary drama and fiction, and TV shows and movies. They use this is a template that Joseph Campbell identified in his Hero with a Thousand Faces book. And so the first step on the hero's journey is the call to adventure, right? And so what happens with the call to adventure is you are in your normal, ordinary world, and then you get the call, which is an invitation to a special world. Well, invariably what happens in the hero's journey is the hero refuses the call when it initially comes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my case. So essentially, I received the call by having difficulty swallowing one day. And then it went on for about 6 months. And it wasn't problematic so much. And I just lived with it. And I made up a story about what it was, and it was nothing serious. And then I developed a lump on the side of my neck. And that concerned me, but I didn't pay that much attention to it because it wasn't really adversely impacting my functioning. And then on the hero's journey, invariably what happens is you get a mentor who points the way and helps you leave the ordinary world to go into the special world. And the mentor for me turned out to be a friend who was a pediatric oncologist. And she saw the lump and she said, you ought to go get that checked out because it's better to find out what's going on early than later.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did, and it turned out that it was a cancer at the base of my tongue. And then the journey, now I'm entering the special world, and the journey has to do with all the different people I encountered along the treatment process. The oncologist, the radiologist. I had to go for biopsies. I had to go for endoscopies and colonoscopies. So all these people and all these places comprise the journey. And then at the end of it, you return back to the ordinary world, which is where I am right now, trying to resume the life I had before with all this new knowledge now. I know way more about cancer and cancer treatment than I ever wanted to know. And I never really thought of myself as a cancer guy.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that it's caused by a virus that's somewhere, I read a statistic that somewhere like 48% of the males in the country are carrying this virus.
Huh.
And I was actually carrying the virus for 50 years without it manifesting as cancer.
Wow.
So how I dealt with the trauma was to reframe it in this hero's journey and have a ton of support people, really good support people around me. And I fired a number of medical professionals that I didn't feel were supportive.
Good for
I
you. I think that's a very important thing.
I left one hospital against medical authority,
Mm.
AMA. They didn't like that.
Mm. Yeah, so you reframed it in the hero's journey. The hero's journey, the more you talk about it, the more it's ringing bells for me.
Right.
And that's, it's one of those things. It's. I always think to myself, what about when the this hero, he gets to a certain point and it's the hero needs help, and the help in your case was all these people coming into your life, transitionally, most of them, to help you with your health. Just a kind of a side note, I think it's important to note that you needed that help, even though you are so well educated. This was something that was outside your wheelhouse.
Exactly.
And what I find that the mistake I've made in my life and what I see others making is sometimes we think that we've got to be the hero and we've got to do it all and we've got to know it all. And it's like, wait a minute.
No.
This is not, this is not Lord of the Rings. Well, that went on forever, right? But or a half-hour TV show where this hero overcomes insurmountable odds in a fantasy world.
Right.
This is real life.
Yeah.
And I find sometimes my trauma comes from my expectation on myself when I fall short on something that is completely unrealistic anyway. So I'm really glad you brought that up about the hero's journey and getting that help.
Here's an interesting piece of it. So all this transpired when COVID started to really become a problem in the country, in the world. I never saw the face of a single person who treated me. They were masked. Every person was masked the whole time. So if I was in a grocery store, they could be standing right next to me. I wouldn't recognize them.
Yeah. It's kind of weird. And then you get used to it.
Totally weird.
Yeah.
Having all these people serving as allies and experts and never, seeing their face.
Kind of makes you wonder about the trust factor when you can't see someone's full expression, and you're almost like desensitized from that inner relation because it's more like what we're doing now, right? There's like this separation between us. Well,
yeah.
And how, just before we move on to the next question, just how are you doing? Are you cancer free now? Are you still
I'm cancer free. You need to have periodic checkups initially it's every 3 months, then it goes to 4 months, then it goes to 6 months, then it goes to a year.
Okay.
And so far I've been cancer free.
Okay.
But I have a lot of residual problems, like my beautiful professorial beard has become all wispy, and have my saliva glands have been compromised, and I have mucositis, which means constant mucus, and so I have to keep hydrating.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're cancer free. I'm sorry you have all these.
New normal.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Sometimes there's no going back. It's more of acceptance of where we're at and how do we make the best of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. That's part of the Guts program, is really kind of diving into all of life and not just the shiny surface of things,
Uh-huh. Getting under the skin.
Yeah, man. Oh, yeah. I like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, continuing with our trauma talk, as an adult, how can we become more aware of and move past our childhood trauma?
Okay, so the awareness part is really interesting. You know who Natalie Goldberg is?
Not sure.
She's a Buddhist writing teacher.
Okay.
So years ago, I took a workshop with her. I wanted to learn about writing, and I used to be I actually started out as an English major at UCLA. And so one of the things I took away from her workshop is she said, make writing she called it a spiritual practice. I call it a mindfulness practice, and do it every day. And in the process of doing it, she said, just simply learn to write about the things that disturb you. And so in that process, as you begin paying increasing amounts of attention to the things that disturb you, what you discover is a lot of unconscious and a lot of early unconscious that lives in the right hemisphere, often non-verbally until we access it and put words to it. And so one of the things you discover, like an example would be, for me, was through this writing process, this writing practice, I discovered that I had a significant loss in my life that I never realized I had and never grieved. And I know that grieving is critically important for healthy functioning because I was a volunteer grief counselor for 25 years at a local agency. And so to discover this loss that I had that I never realized was monumental for me. And what it was my older sister became pregnant when I was 9 years old. And she left the family and had a child that she had to give up for adoption. So I lost this relative. Never knew about, never met, just was totally not in my conscious memory. And then upon this discovery, I spoke to my other sister about it, and she decided that she was going to go and search and try to find this child that my older sister had and see if she could make a connection. And she was able to do that.
Oh boy! And did you get to meet?
I didn't get to. My younger sister got to meet. My older sister, whose daughter it was, she was dead by this time.
Oh gosh!
Yeah.
And how old was your sister when she had the baby?
She was 16.
Okay.
Yeah, there was 7 years difference between us.
Okay. Well, that sounds rough.
Yeah.
That's something I've been. It's so funny. This keeps coming up. These same two topics of grief and loss and how they associate with trauma. And I've personally been finding that it's hard for me to go there. I've experienced, like most people, loss. The most tender or open wound loss I've got right now is that my wife has been sick for about 4.5 years. So that's really been challenging as a dad, as a husband.
What's she been sick with?
She's got a couple things. The biggest thing is she's got fibromyalgia, and she got hit really hard with it on my birthday 4.5 years ago. So
Wow.
bedridden, hospital, all that kind of stuff, and kind of limited in what she can do, constant pain. And so
I'll send you a link to an MD who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, who is worth reading in terms of these kinds of conditions.
oh, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll share that in the show notes too, so everybody
Okay.
else can see it as well.
Her name is Veronique Mead,
Okay.
and I'll send that.
Yeah. So I won't go too deep into my story here, but it's an interesting thing, and I think a lot of us are dealing with grief and loss. A lot of it pandemic related,
Absolutely.
either loved ones, jobs, a way of life that maybe we liked better than what we
Right?
got now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
becoming aware of trauma, um, how would I say it? So much of the trauma that we've experienced in our lives that we're not aware of actually takes up residence early on in our lives in the right hemisphere, usually without benefit of language, because a lot of it, for many of us, happened before we acquired language. So all we have are the feelings that we had, the visions we had, the sounds we heard, all the sensory experiences we had, but we didn't have a narrative to go along with it.
Mm-hmm.
But it lives in us, nevertheless, right? So somehow you have to find access to it. And one of the ways I've discovered is, by writing about what disturbed me, keeping a journal. Often we are disturbed by things that really aren't or shouldn't be disturbing. Like, for example, since my cancer treatment, I find my threat detection circuitry is way more sensitive than it ever used to be. Also, as I've gotten older. And so a delivery man can show up in my driveway and I can look out this window here and I can feel my stress hormones elevate just because it's UPS. Never used to be like that, but now it is. And so I have to pay attention. I have to do specific things like breathe and move my body to help metabolize those stress hormones.
And you kind of bringing that up, and that sounds like a couple of the ways.
Those are two really good ways.
Yeah, and those are easily accessible, right? The breath, or hypothetically easily accessible, because if we're having a trauma experience or reliving trauma, or if that anxiety rises, I find the first thing to go is the breath. That like, oh yeah, all I have to do is take some deep breaths, and that like physically and chemically changes what's happening in your body and your brain.
So basically what happens is, sighing is another good way, like, and actually breathing out longer than breathing in, what it does is it lowers the heart rate. And when the heart rate lowers, that sends a signal to the brain that whatever was elevating your heart rate is no longer necessary to react to. So it quiets the threat detection circuitry that's firing all these synapses.
Kind of puts you in a different room, gets you out of that limbic place.
Exactly. Yeah. That reactive place. So sighing, breathing, talking to other people, getting help with co-regulation. Here's another really interesting fact. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the brain, how it works. So it's basically a network, and it's composed of, it's like a giant matrix, 128 billion cells making over 1 trillion connections. Now, most people's brains really can't conceptualize those numbers, right? It's just a massive amount, right? Well, here's what's really interesting about that, and that is 98 billion of those neurons are contained in the cerebellum. It's that structure that sits right underneath. I can show you right here. It's this structure that sits, this green structure that sits underneath the base of the brain. Mm-hmm. So that's where relative to size, it's hard to believe that the difference is that great, right? Mm-hmm. 98 billion here and 19 billion here. I don't know if that comes up to the numbers, but basically it's the proportions. Those are the proportions, right? Yeah. And they're really jam-packed in the cerebellum. Okay? Mm-hmm. Well, guess what the cerebellum is primarily, its primary function is? It's moving the body. And a number of neuroscientists believe that the brain evolved primarily to move the body because living things that don't need to move don't have brains. Daniel Wolpert has a brilliant TED Talk taking us through the whole evolutionary process. So moving the body is a powerful way to help metabolize stress hormones associated with trauma. I had a number of years ago, Christmas Eve, my wife and I were getting ready to go to bed, and all of a sudden there's this loud knock at our door. And I thought, "Oh, who's this?" And I go to the door, and the dogs start barking, and I open the door cautiously. I look out, and there's a guy there, and he's wide-eyed, and he says, "Did you know that your chimney's on fire?" It's like, no. And I look, until I actually went up and looked, I was relatively calm, but then I saw these 8-foot giant flames shooting up off the roof, and my stress hormones just went through the roof. So great that I couldn't think, I basically froze. And suddenly then I could hear myself in a little child's voice. I said, "What should I do?" And he said, "Well, you should probably call 911, and do you have a hose?" And it's winter, right? And so I go to the first hose bib, turn it on, and it's frozen. I go to the next one, it's frozen. I'm racing around the house, right? I go to the one that we keep outside there, we put the water for the dogs, and it's working. And so immediately I run, I grab a ladder, I climb up on the roof on the ladder, wander over the roof in the dark. I got the hose, and I take one squirt with the hose, and immediately knocks down all the flames. And as soon as I saw that, I could feel my stress hormones just go, shoo. The house isn't going to burn down. It's going to be okay.
Wow, that's Mark. That's some story. I could see it,
Right?
and I could identify with it. Also, that moment where it's literally a moment where almost like a switch gets flipped. Right? We could be completely,
Exactly.
fine, and then it's like our brain stops working. And I look at it. It's funny you mentioned water with this. I look at it like it's almost like a raging river, right? Like at any moment, an external source can cause us,
Flood.
a flood, or an internal source, right? Just internal anxiety, fear, worry,
Thoughts, yeah.
thoughts, emotion. And I like to look at it like it's like a river. And even when the river is raging, the question is, am I drowning in it? Which for a moment you were when your chimney was on fire,
Yeah.
or are we making space so we can observe it? Right? It doesn't mean it's not happening. It doesn't mean we're not experiencing something traumatic or intense. It just means that we are still able to identify what's going on and kind of process it and make room for thought instead of
That's
panic.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. We can't really think well when what stress hormones actually do. I wish I could show you this slide I have. Basically, what they do is they sever what's called a binding protein that keeps the cells connected. So high levels of stress hormones just sever them, just run through the network and cut all the connections. So you can't think. But as soon as I spray that fire and I realize that we're not going to lose the house, we're not going to lose all our possessions, it's going to be fine, everything came back online.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a key piece. That's how fast cells in the brain connect and disconnect.
Wow.
It's
So
really, I call it, or David Eagleman actually at Stanford calls it live wired.
mm-hmm.
And he's written this. He's done the PBS series on the brain, and he's written this book, Live Wired.
Mm-hmm. I've seen that book. Yeah.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite neuroscientists. He did this really brilliant TED talk
Mm-hmm.
about his work to help us grow other senses, like using the skin as a sense organ for hearing or seeing. It's pretty amazing work.
Wow. There's so much, so much. My goodness, it's overwhelming the amount of information there is to learn.
400,000 studies in neuroscience are published every year.
Wow, holy cow! And I bet you read them all, right?
I read them all. Absolutely.
If it's okay with you, I actually kind of have a follow-up question that I didn't have planned, but I think it's an important one.
Sure.
And that's you just talked about these kind of connectors that get severed, and then as the stress lowers, they reconnect, which thank goodness they do. I'm wondering what happens to the human brain if there is constant stress happening daily. So almost like I guess that switch doesn't get turned back on as easily. Is there long-term damage, I guess?
That's an interesting question because we don't actually know at this point. If you take somebody and out of a high stress situation and put them in a nurturing, uh, loving, supportive environment, like Bruce Perry has a really great story about what he calls the boy who was raised as a dog.
Hmm.
So this is a Romanian orphan who early on in his development really had impoverished networks and network connectivity, right? Well, he was adopted by American parents and raised in America, and he had difficulty self-regulating because he didn't have sufficient network capacity to be easily able to regulate himself. And this is something that we acquire from being well parented, right? Our own, until we develop our own capacity, our parents have to do the work of soothing us and helping us calm down after stressful experiences,
Mm-hmm.
right? If we didn't get that, which this Romanian orphan didn't get, then you have to grow it later on. And so right now the thinking, and my thinking is different, but right now the field thinks that there's basic, windows beyond which, and we know that certain of those senses can't be, like if you're blindfolded from birth to 2 or 3 years, I'm not sure exactly the amount of time, but you'll never develop sight.
Wow.
You really do need that early visual experiences to develop the networks to allow you to see. But that's, where we are right now in the field. What David Eagleman's saying is that, well, you may not be able to make your eyes work visually, but the capacity for your skin to become quote unquote eyes is what he's working on.
Hmm. Yeah.
I encourage people to watch his TED Talk. It's really compelling.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a TED Talk is compelling when Chris Anderson, the moderator, gets up afterward and talks to the presenter. He has a long talk with Dave.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, we could just talk about that for days, just that whole, sense deprivation and how it can. It reminds me of a TV show called Psych. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but in this show Psych, there's this kid, Sean Spencer, and his dad's a cop. And so his dad would do all these kind of sense deprivation things. He'd put like blindfold on him and be like, okay, what do you hear? Or what do you remember being different in the room? Not being able to look at it, and it's comical, but it also kind of taps into an interesting thing about kind of strengthening these different facets of perception.
They do, yeah.
Yeah, and I think and please tell me if I'm incorrect. I think that can be done with the brain as well.
Well, that's what he's doing.
Well, what I mean is that we can do it like with the ability to be in awareness more.
Develop more network capacity.
Yeah, yeah. And
so they've done scans of long-term meditators,
mm-hmm.
and what they discover is primarily two areas of the brain are profoundly different from people who haven't engaged in these extensive practices. And the two areas are the prefrontal cortex it's called the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a pathway that connects the limbic system to the prefrontal cortex. And so what that increased amount of fibers does, it allows us to recover quickly when we get emotionally hijacked. It's not that they never get, triggered by events in the world. It's just that they have the capacity to immediately, self-regulate.
Yeah.
The other pathway that they discover is the corpus callosum, which is the band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres, right and left hemisphere. And that becomes much more thicker and way more robust in long-term meditator.
That's very interesting.
And along the same lines, another interesting area is Einstein left his brain to to be for research, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what they discovered in Einstein's brain is it's just like this, except for one difference, and that is, whoops, I'm having to go backwards here. This little fissure right here, it's called the Sylvian fissure.
Mm-hmm.
Einstein, he didn't have it, was all filled in, connected. So the parietal and the temporal lobes, is the parietal and this is the temporal lobe, have this massive wiring going back and forth between it. And my hypothesis is that's what allowed him to be able to envision all the things that he envisioned with quantum physics and such.
Because that portion was more developed than the quote-unquote average brain.
And I have a theory about how that came to be for him. I don't think he was born with it. I think he developed it as a consequence of spending 7 years in the Swiss Patent Office and then walking back and forth from the office every day with a colleague and discussing all the brilliant new inventions that they reviewed for patents that day. I think that was another piece of it, was that he had a lifelong group of physicist friends that he met with on a regular basis, called the Olympia Club. And that changed his brain. That's my belief.
Yeah, wow.
So that is hopeful for all the rest of us, right? We can all fill in the fissure between our temporal and parietal.
Well, it brings up a really good point, because I'm just learning about this. There's a book called Mindset that talks about this, kind of like the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset, right?
Right.
And I think I've been guilty of this myself, where I feel like, well, kind of this is just how it is, right? I get in that kind of headspace sometimes. I'm like, you know what? No, that's not true. Our brain is plastic. Our brain is pliable, and if we change our behavior or change the input, things can be different.
Absolutely. The key word that I walk around with every day is the word yet. I haven't manifested it yet. I haven't realized it yet. But I don't know what's coming down the road. I don't know who's going to show up. I don't know what. Like before I was diagnosed with cancer, I didn't really know good oncologists or radiologists. And they came into my world.
Yeah. So, a little bit before we were talking about your own childhood, and I wanted to ask you, are there ways, preferably easy ways, but that we can help children deal with trauma? And this is like just for myself as a parent, for all the other parents out there. Is there a way to help them heal or at least recover from it? I mean, it sounds like just the same tactics you talk about, movement, breathing, are really good low-hanging fruit.
So what makes an experience traumatic is how the stress hormones impact our body and our brain. And stress hormones occur on a spectrum, right, or on a trajectory. And I don't know how familiar you are with polyvagal theory, but in polyvagal theory, they show how different degrees of stress hormones impact our nervous system. And the highest amount of stress hormones will put us in the freeze response, where we just, shut down. And usually, the most severe trauma is associated with some kind of immobilization, right? So where children are concerned, the best thing we can do is to find effective ways to gently help them metabolize stress hormones. Find some way back to help them co-regulate, to come back to let them know that they're safe, that they're going to be protected, that you've got their back. I don't know if you remember, it's one of the very first blogs I ever wrote. It's called The Big Brain Question. You remember that one?
Yeah.
So the big brain question is essentially that. And the question is, are you there for me? Meaning, are you someone I can count on to help me regulate after I become, hyper aroused?
Mm-hmm.
And we can all do that for each other, right?
Yeah. Not just the kids. Yeah, that makes good sense. And we can do it for ourselves too, I think, to a degree. Is that self-comfort.
If we have sufficient network capacity in any moment.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite lines is from the founder of self psychology, Heinz Kohut. He said, the mark of a good relationship is when only one person goes crazy at a time.
That's great. Because the other one who's not, quote unquote, going crazy is helping
self-regulate.
Co-regulate. Yeah. Interesting. Wow. Yeah, that's just great advice, relationship advice. It makes me think about when I was a kid, and two of my non-fond memories are I was a talker, just like I am now, and I remember being told to shut up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also called derogatory names, which I won't mention here on the podcast. We'll keep it clean. But it was fairly consistent. And it was very traumatic as a kid, having a parent kind of put this label.
Right.
And not saying, hey, I'm here for you. Hey, I understand you're struggling. And now as an adult, like trying to kind of detangle that or kind of jettison it from...
Unlearn it.
Yeah, unlearn it. It's... What I like about what you said is that you're putting a lot of power, so to speak, in the hands of the parent to help that experience be a learning experience and less traumatic, right? Instead of adding trauma on the trauma.
Right. So here's a key takeaway, and that is, as far as the brain is concerned, almost all evaluation is experienced as threat, meaning it elevates our stress hormone. And I had this really eye-opening, awakening experience. I was taking an online brain study course with an Israeli neuroscientist, and he would periodically put true and false quizzes into the course. And I thought, this will be fun. I'll just take one of these tests for fun. I mean, I'm not getting a grade or I'm not getting a degree for it. I'm just doing it for my own, to see what he has to teach me. And so I started to do the test, and I get the first one, true, false, true. And then I come to the third or fourth one, and suddenly I don't know the answer. And I'm immediately cast back into grade school, where I remember taking these exams like this and not knowing the answer and feeling the flood of stress hormone. just flood my system. So basically, my brain is acting as if there's a threat here. When I'm sitting in my office, just looking at the computer, there's no danger here. But my body's acting in terms of it's elevating my stress hormone levels as if there is a real threat because of the conditioning of taking tests in grade school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm being evaluated, and I'm coming up short.
What I find fascinating about this is here I am talking to somebody who by far, Mark, you know more about the brain and how it works than anybody else I've ever met. And still, with all that knowledge, the brain still does what it wants sometimes.
More often than not.
Yeah. It's when the kind of the man, it's almost like a good leader, right? But because of that knowledge and through practice, we can lead that limbic, or that emotional or negative thoughts, down a different path than maybe we would have in the past.
Here's one of the things I realized as a consequence of my intensive study of the brain, and that is because of the way networks are configured and because of the way cells fire action potentials, electrochemical charges, and because of the complexity, right, the massive network that's operating, in any moment, every one of us is doing the very best our brain and body will allow us to do. And in the next moment, we may be able to be more skillful. But, Putin right now is doing the very best his brain will allow him to do. It's unfortunate, right? But that's the best. But another reality is, in any moment, his brain may make certain connections. He says, "Wait a minute, what am I doing?" Right? He could have that awakening.
Yeah.
People around him could develop the capacity to, express to him in ways that don't threaten him, where he could actually have a different perspective.
Yeah.
Like me against the whole world. What are the odds of me being successful with that?
Mm-hmm. Well, that particular question you just asked needs to come from a place of a certain amount of what I call being awake or in consciousness, right?
Yeah.
If you are just driven by ego and power and putting your stamp on a history book, so to speak, I think we would make a very different decision than if we were to sit there and think, well, how is this going to affect my kids and my kids' kids?
Exactly.
And the planet we live on.
Right.
What if I took all these resources that I am currently pushing into killing people and hurting people and causing strife? What if I took all those resources, all those people, all that money, all that effort, and put it into something positive?
Right. It would make Ukraine want to become a part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's so inviting, right?
Yeah. And I think this brings us to a different part of existence where, there's the brain, which of course is physical, but there's a lot of metaphysical things I think going on in the brain. And part of that is what we might call spirituality or consciousness, connection to the world we live in.
Uh-huh. The transpersonal part.
Yeah. Yeah. That all this is just a blip in our continuous existence as beings, as part of one universe, which talk about billions of brain cells being hard to wrap your brain around. Then thinking about that also, it's quite interesting though.
Andrew Newberg's a neuroscientist, has written a number of books, and one of the books he's written the title is "Why God Won't Go Away." And he makes he's one of the people who also scanned long-term meditators to see how their brains are different.
Yeah. So just a question for you. How are you doing? We've been going for a while.
I'm okay.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
So I'll hit you up with some more questions then.
All right.
This is fantastic, by the way. As expected, I'm learning a ton from you. And it's just such a pleasure to talk about this with you, Mark.
That's what I discovered about studying the brain. It's really fun.
Yeah. It's fun, and it's one of those things too that we can test it out on ourselves,
Exactly.
right? And so, did
Yeah.
this work? Did that work? And I remember being a kid and a younger man and getting totally drowning in that river I talked about earlier. And now I'll catch myself. I'm totally immersed in a thought or a worry
Uh-huh.
about my wife or about money or whatever. And then I'm like, wait a minute. And I literally kind of like get out and towel off. And I'm like, okay, here's what's happening.
So you're able to observe, step back and observe.
Yeah.
So over time, your brain has changed. You have
Yeah.
developed network connectivity that you didn't have when you weren't able to take that step back.
Yeah. Woohoo. That's good news.
And you'll be able to do it faster and faster and faster as time goes by.
Well, yeah, I see it. I notice it. And it becoming more and more, it's like stepping, almost like there being a line on the floor,
Uh-huh.
just a nondescript line. And when I catch myself on the drowning side, I'm just like, okay, and just hop over. I'm like, wow. And it's this weird line that I'm walking. So it's a very interesting transition, you know.
I call it the line between wisdom and ignorance. And most of my days are spent on the ignorant side of the line, believe me.
Me too. But at least we're aware of the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I would posit is that the ignorant side of the line, we end up there as a consequence of how stress hormones affect our capacity to be present in the moment and realize that there's no danger. There's no need for elevated levels of stress hormone in almost every moment of our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that ruminating on something that's happened or worrying about something that
Exactly.
might happen.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, I think there are situations. I don't know if they're always life threatening, but I think things like if you don't have a job and you can't pay your mortgage, that's a constant stress that needs to be managed,
Yeah.
right? But what I find is, as you mentioned, situations like that where we're managing it with breath or with movement, with meditation,
Or with
mindfulness,
collaboration.
yeah, collaboration. We almost like stop thinking so we can think, and then we start to use our brain as a tool for a solution,
Exactly.
as opposed to a tool to make ourselves that insane person in the relationship.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I've got another question for you, and is there such a thing? And you've talked about this. I've read about this in some of your articles. Tell me more about this thing you call compulsion to repeat trauma.
Okay, well, so Pierre Genet was a French neurologist, and he was the precursor of Freud. And Freud took Genet's um, observation that in many of his clients, he would see these experiences repeating over and over. They'd get into the same kinds of, they'd end one relationship and get into a similar relationship with the same dynamics and the same difficulties. And what Freud basically discovered, well, he discovered a lot of things, but one of the things he discovered is that a lot of these, um, he called them compulsions, have their roots in childhood. And as I began to think about how the brain and how it works, I have an advantage that Freud didn't have, and that is, all the extensive scanning and tools we now have to be able to peer inside active living brains. What I've decided is that we don't have a compulsion to repeat the trauma. We have a compulsion to try and heal the trauma. But more often than not, the healing doesn't happen. And more often than not, it doesn't happen because we don't disconnect the wiring that trigger the activation of stress hormones. We just add one trauma, a similar trauma on top of the already existing one. What has to happen for a trauma to be resolved is we have to have the wiring associated with the original trauma become disconnected from the threat detection networks in the brain that activate the flooding of stress hormones. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah. And there are new body-centric somatic therapies that really do a good job, like somatic experiencing or EMDR, or
Mm-hmm.
I think I put a list on my blog. If you type in the word modalities in the search box, you get a list of about 20 different modalities that are really one of the most effective ones, which is really interesting, was this group in New York that put together inner city kids and had them each write the story of their lives, which are just filled with trauma, right? And then put on a play, acting out, physically moving on stage in front of an audience all these traumatic experiences. And that ended up rewiring their brains, and so that they became essentially healed of these early adverse experiences.
Wow.
So movement is really actually movement in the service of metabolizing stress hormones is really a powerful healing modality.
It's really interesting as you've brought that up a few times, and my younger son, he's a big volleyball guy, nearly 6 feet tall, towers over me. But what he does when he gets stressed, and I didn't teach him this, he goes down in the basement. He's got like a little basketball hoop down there, and he kind of just starts moving, right? And I can't wait to tell him that he's doing the perfect thing to deal with his stress. And we let him do it. He's mentioned, Dad, Mom, when I start to feel stressed, I need to go down there and do this. It helps me.
Right.
And he loves the brain. He loves talking about the brain, and I'm sure he'll be excited to listen to this, these episodes that we're doing. So, thanks for that reinforcement that my son is really kind of just keyed into a way of helping himself.
Well, he's just paying attention to how he feels before and after, right?
Yeah.
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 The thing I didn't mention is with the fire story, the chimney fire story, is this is like 10 o'clock at night. When the fire trucks finally left, what I did is I leashed my dog up, and the two of us went for a 20-minute jog up and down the road to help metabolize those stress hormones. And I got a great night's sleep.
Wow.
And no trauma about having a fire in the fireplace anymore.
So does it kind of this when you say metabolizing, and kind of is it actually kind of is that the healing? Is this physicality?
My
helping?
belief is that it's the if it's early trauma that's residual and currently with us, it's changing the wiring, right? So I use the chimney fire as an example. So if what happened was I couldn't put the fire out and the house burned to the ground, that would be a significant trauma. And if I didn't do anything to metabolize that experience, I wouldn't be able to be in a house with a fire going in the wood stove.
Yeah.
It would just be too. I would just make me too nervous, right?
Mm-hmm.
But because I was able to effectively address the situation, it hasn't been a problem for me to continue to heat the house with wood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great metaphor too. Just look at this, the whole fire thing, which literally happened to you. But here's this, because it can feel like our brain's on fire, right? When we're experiencing
High
trauma.
levels of stress hormones feel that way.
Yeah.
They're not pleasant.
No.
And much of my belief is much of the things we become addicted to are efforts to try to regulate those stress hormone levels.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, they're very effective.
Mm.
It's just that they have these really adverse side effects that are often worse than the problem we're trying to address.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw that happening to myself when my wife had just gotten sick. We were a couple months in, and I noticed I had started drinking more bourbon while I was cooking dinner.
And why?
To cope, to try, and it wasn't a conscious, like, I'm going to drink an extra bit to cope. It was just kind of this habit that started forming to cope.
Yeah.
And one night I drank like about a third of a bottle, which was a lot for me. I'm a little guy and I'm not a drinker.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got inebriated. I got sick afterward. And then once I sobered up a bit, I said, that's it. I'm done. I was lucky enough to have the wherewithal to say, I am not going to go down this road, because I saw the writing on the wall.
Right.
It was obvious. And that was over 4 years ago. And, I haven't had a drink. I don't miss it. I still have stress. It's not like I've gotten rid of it. But
you manage it differently.
I manage it differently. Yep.
Yeah.
And I manage it quite like what you said. I do a lot of mindfulness work, and every morning I do about 10 to 15 minutes of very intense exercise.
Uh-huh.
And boy, sometimes after that, it's almost like just like cleaning off the dry erase board really good.
That's what you're actually doing.
Yeah.
You're taking those stress hormones and moving them out of your system.
Yeah. I love it. And I didn't exercise today. Yet. Thank you. But I will have opportunity later.
Okay.
So this is fantastic. I think what I love most about this is that I think it can give us all hope.
Absolutely.
That no matter where we're at, that we can work on a place that is more manageable.
128 billion neurons making 1 trillion connections are all working in our favor.
that's
times 8 billion people on the planet.
Well, we've got to get them all on board, though.
Exactly, right? And that's what you're doing with the podcast.
I certainly hope so. That's the goal.
Yeah.
And we are certainly getting into the guts of it too, which I love.
Yeah.
So I think we've talked about a lot of really good solutions and really good ways to handle trauma, stress. I did want to pick your brain and ask what your thoughts are on solutions-focused therapy versus more popular forms of therapy that kind of dig into the past, and you've got to uproot things, and talk therapy is what it's called mostly. Right. And you'd probably be able to define solutions-focused therapy better than me. But what I've learned about that particular kind of therapy is that it's, instead of digging in and upheaving everything, it's about looking at, where can I go from here? What can I do different? Yeah. And please forgive me if I'm misspeaking and correct me.
No. So basically, part of what drew me, so I was planning to become a clinical psychologist, and I got everything I needed to do to sit for the exam. I completed all the coursework, I completed all the hours. And then I had a day of reckoning. I said, you know what? In all the therapy I've had and all the clinical hours I've done, I don't really think I have been helped that much. A couple instances of the crisis management were helpful, but by and large, therapy, in my experience, wasn't that helpful. And when I started to study the brain, I began to realize that, oh, so much of the therapy I've had over the years, all it did was recapitulate without resolution,
Yes.
right? It
Yeah.
just brought stuff back. Now I have traumatic memory on top of traumatic memory. And I don't know if I'm unique in this regard, but I had a lot of therapists who really weren't very good in terms of their boundary setting, in terms of their dual relationship limitations. I wasn't helped by them. In fact, in a number of instances, I can tell you that I was hurt by them. And these were well-regarded therapists, right? And so my study of the brain has sort of highlighted for me what I mean, you got to remember, this is a number of years ago. We've learned a lot more, and with a number of therapeutic modalities, like the ones you can find on the blog, therapy can be much better. Okay, but recapitulating and reenacting traumatic experiences without disconnecting the wiring that triggers stress reactions isn't helpful. At least in my experience.
Yeah, I would agree. I've had some not great practitioners, and I've had some good ones that help. Kind of once we've determined, hey, here's what is happening, right. Then the question becomes, well, what are you going to do about it? Right? How can we let go of this? How can we move past it? How can we heal from it? What triggers it? Like it's not just about like, oh yeah, X, Y, and Z happened. Okay, see you next week, right? And then you're sitting there with this bloody mess of a memory.
So here's a point I want to make that I think is a critical one, and that is there's a huge difference between a relationship that answers the big brain question, are you there for me, and a transactional relationship. So therapy is a transactional relationship, even if no matter how the people may feel about you. If you stop paying a therapist, it's highly likely they're not going to continue to see you. Well, that's a significant limitation, right? Mm-hmm. Because often what we're trying to heal are the experiences we've had with parents who weren't paid to care for you, who weren't paid to help with your development. They did it for whatever reason they did it, right? But they weren't paid for it. It wasn't transactional. Significant difference. And unconsciously, we all know that, right? We all know that if I become, suddenly poverty-stricken, this therapist is not going to be here for me.
Yeah, so
that's a critical piece.
I agree with you, and it's something when I run my business, it's very similar. I look at every interaction as non-transactional.
Uh-huh. How do you get paid?
Well, I do get paid.
But would you do the work if you didn't?
Not usually.
No, because you have to make a living, right?
Right.
Therapists have to make a living.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm not saying that therapists shouldn't get paid. I'm just saying,
no.
This is a transactional relationship. and it has limitations.
It does. But I think from what you're saying is that those limitations, there could be a spectrum of limitations within the transactional relationship.
Exactly.
Some being, hey, I'm going to sit here and grit and bear you talking for 45 minutes
Right.
and get paid. And some is still transactional, but it's intentional with the intent to help.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's more of a hybrid maybe.
Yeah. And I would posit that there are some areas where therapy can't help you, and that is when the relationship needs to be non-transactional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's something very different about talking to a partner or a spouse
Exactly.
who there's no quote unquote strings attached, like except they just want to be there for you, and that
You're committed to helping each other's journey
yeah.
and help each other every time we go crazy.
Which in our house is quite often between the four of us with 2 kids and my wife.
Yeah.
We talked about that earlier, and that's an interesting point because I do notice when someone else is having difficulty.
Uh-huh. In the family?
Yeah, in the family or a client, and that's why I say it's non-transactional with clients, because even after the paid part is over, we still talk. If they've got something they need to talk about, we just chat. It's more. It becomes more than a transactional relationship in my case.
Okay.
But yeah, I notice a lot of times I can become extremely calm and make space for this issue that is unfolding before me. And that goes back what we said in part 1 of our discussion, where it's, kind of being there for someone else.
Uh-huh.
So while they're going crazy, you are kind of like the calm.
Do you know the Rudyard Kipling poem, If?
No.
I'll send it to you. It's basically he's saying that if you can do the things that you're describing, you have become evolved.
Well, that's good news, right?
Except for those times when you can't.
Right. Yep, for sure. Oh. And I've got basically one more question for you, and it's specific to kind of what we're just talking about, because I have seen this firsthand. I've experienced it. It's happened to me, and I've observed it happen to others. And there's this philosophy that I call the suck it up attitude, or the suck it up philosophy, where, when someone is in the midst of experiencing trauma or rehashing it or having this stress response to something,
Right.
there's almost like this, just suck it up and deal with it.
Yeah.
And it's almost like saying to somebody, okay, you're experiencing trauma, too bad, suck it up. And I think that puts an added layer of trauma, because as you're saying is, we're not saying, hey, I'm here for you.
Right.
I can work through this with you. We're saying, like, don't be a wuss.
Well, so here's what's interesting about that perspective, right? Telling somebody to suck it up really can be useful if in you saying that you're able to calm them down enough that they can actually put the network back together and start functioning. That may be a co-regulation interaction that actually works. Often it won't, though, right? Because they don't have the capacity. If they could suck it up, they would, or they wouldn't be in the situation they're in.
And it also depends on the person you're talking to, right? Is that a trigger?
And the nature of the relationship.
Yeah. Is it a trigger, or is it something that maybe that's the way their mind works, and when they hear those words, it's actually helpful?
Exactly.
And
so the person who stopped by my house and told me my roof was on fire, he didn't say suck it up, right? Which is what I needed to do, and what I ultimately did end up doing, right? I went and found a hose that bib that worked, and I put the fire out.
And he also helped you though
Exactly.
in the work where you were when you were like, well, what do I do?
He gave me direction.
He gave you direction.
Yeah.
So, and that's not to say, don't get me wrong. I think saying helping calm somebody down and saying, hey, okay, let's look for a way to get you to a better place
Right.
is different than saying, hey, don't be a wuss. Your trauma, your stress is BS,
So
right? There's a big difference there.
don't be a wuss has a evaluative component to it most often, right?
Hmm.
In other words, you're not measuring up. You're falling short.
You're not good enough.
So that's going to elevate stress hormones for most of us most of the time. But again, depending on the nature of the relationship, depending on how those words actually impact our neurophysiology.
Mm-hmm. I would think a similar phrase, if your true intent as the partner in this relationship is to help the person, you got this.
Yeah,
Could
that's
be a different.
that's the same intention or a similar intention, but a much different way it's generally received, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's affirmative rather than evaluative.
Right. It's not. Oh, well, I guess it could be judgmental, but it's it's putting that person in a positive light instead of saying, get up off the floor, which might be what they need to do, right, Mark?
For some period of time, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting. Oh.
Especially when people are in um, fresh, deep throes of grief.
Hmm.
I can't tell you how much time in my 20s and 30s I spent on the floor, literally,
Hmm.
grieving.
We had a guest on the show. She wrote a whole book about grief. She lost her partner and decided to kind of work through it and talk about it with the world, which I thought was pretty brave.
Yeah.
We talked about grief earlier, but how how can somebody? Is it the same kind of procedure, movement, mindfulness, breath to work through the trauma of grief, or do you think it's a
Again,
different?
so I think I mentioned earlier that for 25 years I volunteered as a grief counselor.
Yeah.
And we initiated the second program in the country for grieving children. And one of the things we discovered, so the kids would come in with their parents once a week. The parents would go to their own group, and the kids would be with us. And we had the components of the program were they come in, they sit in a circle. For the first 5 minutes, they say who the person was that died and what they died of. And once we went around the circle and did that, and they didn't have to, but it was safe enough that by and large, mostly they all did it. And then after that, we would put them into activities that were primarily focused on the right brain, like art and sand tray and mask making and clay and painting, all right brain activities. And we had this room called the steam room, which was a room that was carpeted on all the walls and the floor. And the kids would go, and there was a punching bag in there, and there was a ton of pillows in there. And each week, the kids would vie to see who could be the first cohort of kids that could get to use the steam room, because that's where they all wanted to go. And they would get in there, and they would wrestle, and they would throw pillows, and they would punch the bag, and they'd climb up on the bag, and they'd jump off it into the pile of pillows. And my belief, based on this experience, is that what they were doing is in this initial circle where we asked them to say who died and what they died from, they were activating neural networks that were recalling the death, and in a number of cases it was a traumatic death. And then they were going into this program, accessing cells in the right brain, and also metabolizing the stress hormones associated with that loss by physically moving in the steam room. And the kids, by and large, did much more quickly and much more integratively better than their parents. The parents had integrated the loss much more easily than the parents did, because we didn't know this then, about what the mechanisms were that were actually impacting their healing and their integration.
Yeah. That's amazing. I want to go in that room.
Well, I got to go in every week.
But this is, for me, this is putting a lot of the, puzzle pieces together, because I think it's given myself and everyone listening a clear path to like things that we can actually do. It doesn't have to be sitting down and, mulling over something for an hour. It could be asking ourselves a couple of questions like, who died and what did they die of?
Yeah.
Or in the case of my wife being sick, what does she have and what's changed? Right. What does she have and what have I lost? And then just going for a run.
There you go.
Can be this therapy.
With that intention.
Yeah.
To metabolize the stress hormone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is just, thank you for sharing that. To me, that's, I just kind of feel like you opened up the blinds and put light in the room. So, I mean, I don't know how we did it. We've been talking for a while, Mark, but I've asked you all my planned questions plus some extras.
All right.
And I do want to make sure it'll be in the show notes for the episode and on YouTube. But I want to make sure everybody knows how to get in touch with you, or at least to read your work.
Sure.
So I know we've
Flowering Brain.
Yeah, floweringbrain.wordpress.com.
Or just type Flowering Brain into any search engine and I'll show up.
Okay. Is there anywhere else people should go if they want to read more of your work or learn about your books and things like that?
Well, I can just put my name into Amazon. I think there's like 17 books there.
Oh my
or something.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Okay. And I've read the ones on parenting, which were fantastic. And that's how we started our relationship with the advent of talking about those books. But Mark,
one of my early interests was in, and I used to teach classes specifically in this for graduate students, was in listening skills. And one of the things I realized was that, everybody tells you to learn to listen better, but they don't actually tell you what to do to actually accomplish that, right? So I wrote a trilogy of 3 short little books, Noble Listening, Fierce Listening, and Sacred Listening, to give you specific things to practice to become a better listener. And many of them are essentially tools and tricks for managing your stress hormones, expanding your awareness of how you're adversely impacted and how hard it is to listen when your stress hormones are in an elevated state.
Yeah.
I can't listen for poop when I'm stressed.
Well, on that note, we brought it down to the baseline of poop, Mark.
There you go.
I want to thank you for making the time today to talk with me and really just answer my questions and to help us all learn more about our brains. Yeah, it was a blast.
Learning about the brain is really activates the neural network in ways that is just really delightful. Yeah. I mean, I just got a new book yesterday, and I'm excited to read it, right?
Brain Meets World.
Published by the Behavioral Science Press. Yeah, so this kind of stuff is really juicy for me and fires those action potentials.
Yeah. Well, I'll thank you one more time. If you want to read more and learn more from Mark, go to floweringbrain.wordpress.com or just Google Flowering Brain. Yeah. If you want to listen to more Guts podcast, it's available everywhere. We're at 10 now. We've made it to that benchmark, which a lot of podcasts don't. So I'm grateful for that.
Nice.
And yeah, Mark, you have a great day.
All right, Joey. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome. And everybody, thanks for listening.
Bye for now.
Bye.